You are listening to an American Free Press podcast. Joining me on the line is Professor Ralph Richard Banks, who's just written a great book called Is Marriage for White People? Professor Banks, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Professor Banks, would you prefer to be called Rick or Ralph or Professor Banks?
You can call me Rick is fine. That's the name that people who know me use.
Okay. Well, thank you. Rick, the book was terrific. I really enjoyed it. Of course, I knew very little about this topic, and I, of course, want to get into this in a moment. But for the benefit of the listeners, could you tell them who is Professor Ralph Richard Banks? Where are you from? What do you do?
Well, I teach at the law school at Stanford, where I am the Jackson Eli Reynolds Professor of Law. Teach a variety of courses about race and gender inequality in the context of the family and the workplace under the Constitution. And that work led me to write the book, Is Marriage for White People?, which looks at how marriage is declining in American society, in particular how it's declining the most among African Americans. I went to Stanford years ago now for undergrad and also have a degree in education, a master's degree in education. And I'm also a faculty member by courtesy at the School of Education here. After law school, I did a lot of writing for newspapers and work in education. For undergrad, I went to law school at Harvard, graduated in 1994, clerked for a federal judge, completed a fellowship at Harvard, entered teaching, came back to Stanford in 1998. Prior to all that, I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio.
I see that online here on the website ismarriageforwhitepeople.com. You grew up in Cleveland, youngest child and only boy in a family with 4 children. But when you went to college, you originally didn't concentrate on law, right? I think I read in the book that you wanted to be a therapist.
I thought about that early on. I did. I planned to major in psychology when I came to college and wanted to be, maybe not a therapist, but really to sort of try to understand people's lives and what was happening in their lives. So I've been interested in human behavior ever since childhood, trying to figure out why people do what they do, and then also what are the sort of broader forces that shape people's lives, the big economic forces or cultural forces or biological influences that shape people's lives. Those have always been things I've been interested in.
Was it a big jump from that to law?
I mean, those are connected because law, I think, is unique in that it is very analytical and is very intellectual. Law professors like to think that we engage very big and important issues, but it's also very practical, and it is very concerned, frankly, with the effect of all the rules we have in our society on people's lives, right? What happens on the ground in terms of how people live and whether they're able to be happy or not or to have the things that they need and want in their lives. So what attracted me to law was that it was both an analytical and intellectual, but also very practical and important in people's daily lives.
And I guess law plays a big part in this book because you cited several different laws where marriage interracially was illegal in most states, wasn't it?
Not in most states, but in many states. There's some states that never prohibited interracial marriage, but many states did prohibit interracial marriage, especially in the South. Prohibitions actually only ended, many of them, about 40 years ago. It wasn't until 1967 that the Supreme Court invalidated so-called miscegenation laws that still existed. These laws were quite common. They were part of a broader set of laws, actually, that sort of penalized all sorts of sexual conduct between unmarried people. So the book sort of, explains the transition from that old regime in which all sorts of sexual behaviors were prohibited, in which interracial relationships were prohibited, to the system we have now where people have much more freedom.
Right, and I just want to make clear to the listeners, even though we're talking to a law professor and we're talking about law, this isn't a law book. You just cite a few times throughout the book, maybe about 5 times different laws. It's much more than a law book. Law is a very small part of it.
It does discuss law at various points, but it's not a book that's really about policy, right? So this is not a book that says, here's what the government should do. It started out being more about that, but then as I got into it, people's lives just became so interesting that I began to focus the book more on people's lives. It looks at the big cultural and economic shifts that have reshaped people's intimate lives and made marriage less common now than it's ever been.
Right, yeah, that was actually one of the most fascinating parts of the book. On page 188, you say that a number of issues discussed in this book came directly from the interviews and were not initially a part of my project. Marrying down, the stigma of unwed motherhood, the success gap between black women and men, the anxieties about having biracial children. This book would have been a whole lot different if you didn't get into the interviewing.
Right, yeah. So I started, the way professors usually do, by doing research and reading all that had been written and trying to canvass all the academic literature. And then I decided almost by chance just to interview one woman because she seemed really interested in the book and wanted to talk about her own story. So I agreed to talk with her, and it proved to be a really rich interview because she wanted to express herself. And she was able to really express herself and kind of re-explore her own experiences. And then, it opened up to me a whole world that I hadn't really seen from the statistical data and so forth.
Right.
And then I began to realize that talking to people about their lives actually could shed light on these issues in a way that the cold, hard numbers could not.
Right. Light and depth, I guess.
Exactly.
On page 185, you said that you interviewed approximately 100 people, and some of them more than once, so it wasn't just 5 or 10, which it seems like many books or many interviews take the shape of. That's a lot of people to interview.
What was meaningful to me was that, and I think makes the book rich, is that it wasn't as though I simply talked to people for 10 or 15 or 30 minutes or even an hour. I mean, many of these people I talked to for many hours, so it was less of an interview even and more of really an exploration of their life, which was a rich experience for them and for me, because people were able to understand their lives in different ways and to sort of explore things that have happened 5 or even 10 or 15 years ago and try to reassess. And I was fortunate to be able to take part in that reassessment and reexamination. So the book is very much the result of those in-depth explorations of people's lives.
Right. And I guess at the heart of the book, really, the way that it turned out, it seemed to me at least, are professional single black women. Would that be right?
Yeah, that is true. So the book started with African Americans and the marriage decline generally, but what I realized, and what in fact was motivating me, what I was trying to focus on over time, was that we have heard a lot that there have been many examinations of marriage among white people, basically, sort of in American society generally, what's happening with marriage. And that focuses mostly on whites because they're the largest group. There had also been many examinations of marriage among poor black people and the decline of marriage in the inner city among the so-called underclass. But there hadn't been any serious examinations of marriage among the black middle class. Most of the discussions of marriage among the black middle class were superficial and sensationalistic, and there were media accounts and news shows, but they never really went below the same sort of themes, which were themselves unexamined. So what I wanted to do was to go deeper, basically, than all the existing analyses of the black middle class did, and to try to sort of get to the truth of the matter and see what's going on.
Right. You say here on page 6 that in the middle of the 20th century, approximately 9 out of 10 black women married. Now, it seems like nearly 7 out of every 10 black women are unmarried. We had 9 out of 10, now it's down to 3 out of 10. What's happening?
Marriage has declined throughout American society, but it has declined the most among African Americans. It's declined the most among all groups, among the poor, but it's also declined among the black middle class. So I wanted to look at that decline of marriage among the black middle class. And part of what's going on there, I mean, there are a lot of causes and a lot of consequences. It's like a puzzle, and the book sort of pieces together the puzzle. But part of what's going on there is that African American marriages have declined so much in part because black men in recent decades have struggled so much, both economically and educationally and socially. Black men are incarcerated at unprecedented numbers. They're unemployed at unprecedented numbers. They are lagging behind black women educationally. Only 50% of black boys graduate from high school. So part of the puzzle is that there are fewer men now who are able to fulfill the role of a husband. It's a big part of the reason why marriage has declined.
Really comes down to, as I learned from your wonderful book, it really comes down to supply and demand.
So one of the ideas here is that although we may think of marriage as a matter of love and affection, and it is, relationships also form within a market. What happens in that market is in part the result of the supply and demand of potential partners and the characteristics of those partners. And for men, not being economically stable, not having a job or being in a position to get a job really undermines one's value in the market, because women, understandably, don't want to marry men who have so little to offer economically. Right. So a big part of the story, then again, is that, well, the market has shifted where women may be doing better, but men are doing worse. Women have moved ahead, but men have fallen behind. And as men fall behind, it makes a lot less sense for the women to marry them. So marriage rates decline. They decline throughout the society because this has happened to some extent with men of other races as well, but they decline the most among African Americans because black men are more disadvantaged than other groups of men.
Right. On page 9, college-educated black women are twice as likely as their white counterparts to be unmarried. And that's, I guess, another big part of this puzzle, isn't it?
Right. Marriage has declined the most among the poor, but it's also declined among the black middle class, so that college-educated black women are more likely to be married than poor black women, but they're less likely to be married than their white counterparts. And the big part of the story there is the market, supply and demand. It's true that more women than men graduate college generally, but the gender gap in college graduation is greatest for African Americans. There are nearly twice as many black women as black men who graduate from college. Again, if it's 2 to 1, the numbers dictate that if those women are marrying black men, which the overwhelming majority of black women do, if those women are to marry black men, then many of them will remain unmarried because there simply aren't enough men in their pool. And that's what happens. College-educated women of other races tend to delay marriage. People are getting married at older ages now. So they delay marriage. They get married in their late 20s, in the 30s, and they have children. Then maybe in their 30s they have their first child. And black women, professional women, follow the same pattern, but then it's more difficult for them to cut that deal, to find the husband in their 30s than it is for women of other races. So black women are more likely to be unmarried, and even black women with advanced degrees, this is a little-known fact, and the book has a lot of these, black women with advanced degrees, professional degrees or graduate degrees, are actually not only more likely than their white peers to be unmarried, they are the most likely of any group of women in the nation not to have children. So black women with advanced degrees are the most childless group of women in the nation. And that's not because, as far as we know, they don't want to have children. It's because they don't have husbands and they don't want to have children without the husbands.
Right. There were a lot of shocking statistics as far as I was concerned in the book, and it really is amazing stuff. This is, I guess, a crisis for this particular group of people that you studied. And since there's no market, since the market is diminished because of the reasons you mentioned before, and one of the biggest is incarceration. As you say on page 120, black women marry down because they don't marry out. Why don't you explain what marry down and marry out mean?
The pool of black men is limited in the sense that black men are not as accomplished as black women. Only half as many graduate from college, half as many black men as black women graduate from college. 1 in 10 black men in their 20s are incarcerated. As many as 1 in 4 will spend time in jail. They have higher rates of unemployment, lower rates of labor force participation than other groups of men. So black men are lagging behind black women. And that's just a fact. That's an unfortunate fact, but that's a fact. And so what this means is that for black women who want to marry, if they marry a black man, many of them will marry a less educated or lower earning man. And that, in fact, is what many black women do. More than half of college-educated black women who are married have a husband who did not go to college. So we have lots of professional black women, bankers, lawyers, marketing managers, corporate folks who are married to men who are working class. And that's a very common coupling for African Americans.
Right.
It's also becoming more common in American society generally, but it's a very common coupling for African Americans. The other possibility for black women is to marry a man of another race. And that's what black women by and large don't do. Black women are the least likely of any group to marry someone of another race. Only about 1 in 20 black women has a partner of a different race. And that is less than half as many black women as black men who are married outside the race. And Asian Americans and Latinos marry outside their group 3 or 4 or 5 times as frequently as black women do. So black women are especially unlikely to marry outside the race. And because of that, they are especially likely to marry someone who's less educated or lower earning than they are.
Right. And that would be, of course, marrying down and marrying out. And,
exactly.
Right.
So it's marrying down socioeconomically or marrying out racially.
Right. On page 92, where you were talking about how middle-class black women, college-educated black women have lowered the bar, you were talking about personal ads. And you say here the criteria that many asked for set a very low bar. No drugs, no jail, employed. It's that bad.
There's a big discourse, we might say, that says, why do black women have problems finding husbands, and how come black women can't find a man? Right. And the answer that's often offered is because, well, their expectations are too high. They want too much. And basically, this book says that all that is wrong. That's wrong. Black women don't want too much. Black women want the same things that other women want and that other people want,
right,
which is that they want someone who's a peer. They understand that you're likely to have the best relationship with someone who has similar values, attitudes, interests, aspirations as you do. So they want someone, a man who brings a lot to the relationship and brings a lot to the table. But because the market leaves them with so few options among black men, And this is because we've put lots of black men in jail. We haven't educated them. We don't have a system where they can get jobs. We have all these big problems that result in black men not being able to offer as much, frankly, to black women as black women understandably want. So black women end up settling, many of them, for men who, frankly, don't have all that they want, but they feel that that's just what they have to do. They feel that all that they can ask for is someone who's drug-free and, just sort of very basic sort of stuff. And they actually don't get to ask for the things that they really want. And so one message of this book, and there are a lot of messages, but one message of the book is that perhaps black women should feel free to ask for what they want and to expect to get what they want in a relationship, even if that means finding that relationship with someone who is not African American. That's another option that people haven't explored and that we've almost acted as though it doesn't exist, but it does exist for black women just like it exists for people of every other race who are already increasingly finding that they can have good relationships with people of other races. And there's no reason to think that's not true for black women as well.
Right. On page 181, you say, "We arrive now at the paradox that is at the heart of the story I have told. If more black women married non-black men, more black men and women might marry each other. If black women don't marry because they have too few options, and some black men because they have too many, then black women, by opening themselves to interracial marriage, could address both problems at once. For black women, interracial marriage doesn't abandon the race, it serves the race."
Relationships do form within a market, and part of what happens in those relationships are negotiations between the parties, and part of what determines the outcome of those negotiations is the power that each side has. So in the relationship market with black men and women, black men, especially those black men who are doing well, have a lot more power than black women. And they have a lot more power than black women because those men are scarce. They're hot commodities. So when the men are hot commodities, they have a lot more power because they have a lot more options. The women are less powerful because they have fewer options, frankly, and everybody knows that they have fewer options because there are just not as many attractive, available, desirable black men out there as there are attractive, available, desirable black women. And so if women don't marry because they have too few options, some black men probably don't marry because they have too many options. You kind of balance the benefits of marriage versus being single. And if being single seems really attractive because there are so many women out here, then marriage might seem less attractive in contrast. And that's probably part of what's going on with African Americans. That's part of what explains the fact that even those black men who do have good jobs and who are college educated and earn a nice amount of money, even those men are much less likely to be married than their white counterparts. So at every income level, black men who earn $100,000 a year, say, are less likely to be married than white men or other groups of men who earn $100,000 a year. And part of the story there, I think, is that there's just less incentive to get married because remaining single has a lot of appeal.
Why buy the cow, right, when you can get the milk or something like that?
Right, yeah. Right. And so for black women, so there's this paradox, or this perverse way, I guess, or a sad way in which for black women, their dedication to black men and commitment to black men, while that's admirable and well-intentioned and reflects a real love for black men and a desire to be with black men, it actually makes it more difficult for black women as a whole to get a black man because it kind of tilts the market even more in favor of the men. So while many people think that dating outside the race, marrying someone of another race is abandoning the group or betraying the group, in fact, when black women expand their options, just as other groups of women have done and other groups of people have done, when they expand their options, they get more power in their relationships with black men. And when they get more power in those relationships with black men, it makes those relationships better because now those relationships are operating in a situation where there's a balance of power between the women and the men.
Right.
And when you have that balance of power between women and the men, when the women have more power in the relationships are more likely to be stable, maybe more likely to become marriages than relationships where black men hold all the power and black women hold little.
I guess in that regard, it's a good time to be a black man.
Well, some people benefit from that. Some people are suffering as a result of that. But I think we could all agree that in the long run, we're actually all better off, frankly, if we have men and women who are able to do well educationally, and we have jobs available, and people have options in their personal lives so that they're all able to make the decisions that are best for them. And if you have this balance of power between men and women, that's more likely to result in stable relationships, more likely to result in marriages, more likely to result in situations where black children live with their parents rather than only with one parent, which is the situation we have now. 70% of black children are born to unmarried parents. Most black children do not grow up with both of their parents. And that's just an obvious consequence of the relationship instability among African Americans.
Right. It's very sad, too. Of course, the white boys would still have to learn how to develop swag, though, right, in order for this all to work.
Oh, well, I think so. So swag. So that's an answer to the question of why do so few black women partner with men of other races?
Right.
Black women have the lowest rate of interracial marriage of any minority group. Usually you expect the group that's the largest numerically in a society have the lowest rate of interracial marriage overall, and that group is whites. But black women are actually not much more likely than white men or women to find a partner outside of the race. So big puzzle is, well, why is that black women might seem to have the greatest need to look outside the race because right. Black men are doing so poorly, yet in fact they partner with people outside the race so infrequently.
Right.
And there are two big types of reasons for that. One is some people say that it's because non-black men don't want black women. And there's something to that. Again, this is a puzzle, and that's one piece of the puzzle. But another piece of the puzzle is that a lot of black women just want to be with black men. And one of the reasons is what you call swag, right? The sense of style and way of carrying oneself and attitude that is associated with black men by black women, which a lot of black women find very attractive.
Right. And, of course, another one would be on page 153 where one of your interviewees was explaining how she was getting ready for bed. She was saying, I was putting my scarf on before going to bed one evening, and her non-black partner didn't understand. Explain that to the listeners.
So this is a woman who was talking about how she didn't want to date a man who wasn't black. And I think this particular woman was dating an Asian guy. And she was uncomfortable because she knew that she would have to explain lots of things about herself to a non-black man that she would not have to explain to black men. And one of those things revolved around her hair. How she does her hair, the fact that she covers her hair up at night and wraps it in a scarf so it will stay in place and it'll be easy to comb in the morning. Right. The fact that she doesn't want to get her hair wet by going swimming or going out in the rain. I mean, all sorts of things about hair that most black men would know about because they've grown up with sisters or they have a mother and they know about these things. But a lot of people who aren't black don't know about all the sort of peculiarities of black hair. And more generally, a lot of women would worry that if I'm going out with the white guy or some other guy, there are just going to be a lot of things about me as a black woman that he won't understand, or even worse, won't want to understand.
Right.
So they don't want to explain themselves. And with the black men, they don't have to because the black men, having grown up around black people, already know about all these sort of personal things about black women.
Right. I thought that was, again, not funny, but I thought that was very telling. Really shows the reader that this is a very complex puzzle and there's so many different parts to it.
Right. I think those parts are funny, actually. I mean, they should be funny that women worry about explaining hair or things about their skin or concerned about having ashy legs. And there are all these things right. that are part of black life that are small things, but they're significant because they kind of represent this broader set of anxieties that people have, basically, about integration and about assimilation and about really knowing each other across group lines. A lot of times people work together, or you might have friends of another race, but they don't know each other in a more intimate sense. And people have a lot of anxieties about revealing those really innermost things to people of other races because we still feel that maybe they'll judge us, maybe they'll evaluate us negatively, maybe they won't understand, they won't want to understand. And with someone African American, you just have a sense of comfort that, well, they already know these things.
Right.
But with someone white, you worry. So that's a really big anxiety that lots of people have that extends beyond marriage and family, but it's especially acute in this context of intimate relationships.
Right. And maybe they don't want to explain. They feel like they shouldn't have to explain. They don't want to waste their time explaining.
Right. Another big one is that, this came up from interviews. A lot of black women would talk about not wanting to explain racism to their white partner or to a non-black partner. So they go out to a restaurant or they're at a store in a fancy shopping mall and someone treats them inappropriately or looks at them strange. And they feel that there's some racism at work there or that they're being devalued because of race. And they feel that another black person would understand that, how it feels for the cab driver to pass you by or for someone to not give you good service in a shoe store or to not expect that you'll buy anything. They feel like a black person would understand that, but they don't know if a white person would understand that or if a white person would care about that in the same way. Black women are very sensitive to whether other people are evaluating them based on those stereotypes. And a lot of times people are. So that sort of shapes relationships in many ways.
One of the great things about your book is that I think it has the potential to really knock down several stereotypes that people might hold. On page 86, one of them, black women have always worked more than other groups of women. One of the stereotypes out there is, blacks don't work. Well, here you go. Black women as a group have worked more than white women.
Right. And this is an important point. One of the other points of the book is that a lot of the trends we see with whites are also apparent among blacks earlier and in a more extreme form. So it used to be that black women were viewed as deviant or somehow unusual for holding jobs while they were married and raising children. But now, here it is 30 years later, and most women who are married and have children work. So white women now are working in the same way that black wives were 30 years ago.
Right.
And so you see the same trends among both groups, but black women are kind of at the head of the pack. They're at the front edge of the curve, so to speak. And that's important to understand because it alerts us to the fact that if you want to understand what's happening in American society, perhaps the best thing to do is to look at what's happening with African Americans. Because we see with African Americans in an early form the same developments that we're going to see throughout American society. And the family is a place where that's especially true.
On page 129, you say as recently as 1988, 67% of black women at a southern university said they would rather remain single than date outside their race. More recent research has found that many black women continue to prefer black men. You say here on page 107, as the educational and economic gap between black women and men continues to widen, they will become ever more culturally dissimilar over time, barring a dramatic change in either the labor market or public policy with respect to education. Many black men will seem more and more alien to those black women who have moved ahead. I don't believe that there are going to be any positive changes in the labor market nor public policy. As we talked about prior, the more middle-class black women that will marry outside of their race, that will leave, obviously, less, and so it will be a more even balance of power. But do black men as a group, or does the race face any possibilities of extinction if professional black men marry out?
The central issue, an issue with which we struggle, is that black women are doing a lot better than black men. That's true educationally, it's true economically, it's true socially. It's reflected in the high school dropout rates, college completion rates, incarceration rates, employment rates. Among the younger generation especially, black women are doing better than black men, and they are becoming more different. As black women have stable employment and go to college and earn degrees, and black men don't, they're becoming more different culturally, actually, and they have less in common. So over time, what will happen, up till now, black women have remained unmarried or in marriages of black men with whom they're not well matched, perhaps. Over time, I think it is the case that more black women are going to marry men of other races. We see that happening already. When you look at recent marriages, about 1 in 10 black women is married to a man of another race, which is a big increase from prior years. So those numbers are increasing. Over time, more black women are going to marry non-black men. One point in the book, frankly, is that will be a good development. We shouldn't think that's a bad thing. The reasons for it might be bad, that black men are not doing well, but we shouldn't think it's a bad thing for black women to find the partner who's best for them, even if he's not African American. We shouldn't think it a bad thing for black women to have children who are biracial. We shouldn't think those are bad developments. We should encourage that, in fact, because that leads to black women having better relationships. It leads to more stable situations for black children, and it even helps relationships between black men and women to the extent that black women gain more power in their relationships with black men. So we should encourage and applaud, not simply accept the fact of black women finding relationships with men of other races.
Right. It actually, I guess, in the short term could have the consequence of shrinking the black race because there will be less black women with that certain number of black men. Of course, then it would have to build up. But in the short term, if more professional black women leave the race to go outside of the race to a non-black man, then initially that will, of course, shrink that population.
Well, it would. If more black women marry more non-black men, then yes, there would be more children of black women whose fathers are not black. There'd also be more children of black women who live with their fathers, more children of black women who have close relationships with their fathers, frankly. And that would be a good thing. But the idea of black women having relationships with men of other races does not lead to the genocide or disappearance of the black race. There are 30, 40 million black people in the United States. And we are not going to disappear. That will not happen anytime within our lifetime.
Right.
A lot of people have suggested, frankly, hey, Professor Banks, you're promoting black genocide and self-annihilation. And I think nothing could be more misleading or misguided than such a statement, because all I suggest is that just based on the numbers, black women should do what other groups of people have already done, which is not limit themselves only to men of their own race, to open themselves to the possibility that they may be able to find a good partner from another group. And as a society, we should encourage and support that rather than try to restrict it.
Right. And of course, there's a lot of ground to cover between white and black, a lot of ground. And this book really opened my eyes to that. All of the amazing and fascinating facts and figures and the way that you present the evidence, it really showed me that there is a lot of ground. It's not going to happen because Washington, D.C. says something. It might take many decades.
Oh, yeah, no, I think that's true. The social division between whites and blacks in particular has been a stark one throughout our history. But we're at a point now, I think, where, again, black men have already expanded their options. Based on recent data, about 1 in 5 black men last year married someone of a different race. So we have about 80% of black men who are marrying black women, but about 20% of black men who get married are not marrying a black woman.
Right.
Among Asian Americans and Latinos, they also marry people outside of their group more frequently than black men or black women do. So the question is, have we come to a time where black women should feel free to explore the same sort of options that other groups have already explored? Would it be a good thing for them to explore those options? I mean, that's sort of the ultimate question. And this is not a substitute for programs that help black men and that promote achievement among black men. This is a way of addressing problems that black women confront while we also work on the problems that black men confront.
Fantastic book I see here on the website is marriageforwhitepeople.com.
The book is a question,
right,
is
exactly.
Marriage for white people? Question mark at the end. Is marriage for white people? How the African-American marriage decline affects everyone.
Right. The main reason it affects everyone is because, as we said before, blacks are in the vanguard. So you follow what's happening in the black community, the whites are soon to follow. It might take 30 years, but it's going to happen. I see that the book was one of the top 10 books in 2011 by Wilson Quarterly.
That's right.
That's great.
Which is very good. Yeah, top 10 is a short list, so we're happy to be on the top 10 list. So we've also been reviewed very favorably in all the national media, New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Chicago Tribune, and lots of radio stations and television coverage. So we're happy about that. But these issues are difficult issues, and they're hard issues for people to come to grips with. A lot of times, people don't even want to learn more, frankly, because they feel like the issues are too close to home. Right. So what we're trying to do is to really promote a conversation that we actually all need to have, and to provide some insight and some information that we all need, which can really help people live their lives.
And you have here on the website, you say that you met a girl, Jennifer Eberhardt, that's your wife, right?
Yes, my wife is Jennifer Eberhardt, who is a psychology professor at Stanford, and we met in elementary school originally, and then reconnected later on when I was in law school and she was in graduate school.
Yeah, that's a great story. Is she white or black?
She is African-American.
Okay. Yeah, and I wanted to ask you that also, because you used black and African-American interchangeably. Is one more preferable in your opinion than the other, or does it not
No,
matter?
I think we would do well to not spend a whole lot of time worried about particular designations. African-American, black, white, Caucasian, I think all those are fine. I don't think people should get hung up on that.
I agree.
People of color, all those terms are fine. We shouldn't get hung up on that. What's more important is really to try to understand all the ways that race shapes our lives. And this book looks at the influence of race in the context of the family, in the context of marriage. And that's one of the most important social institutions we have. And race is an important line of division. And in many ways, the book shows both the continuing significance of race, but then it also talks about possibilities for moving beyond race.
Can listeners pick up the book at your website, is marriageforwhitepeople.com?
Yeah, from the website. You can order it on Amazon or through Barnes & Noble. You can find it in bookstores throughout the nation.
Professor Ralph Richard Banks, Rick, the author of Is Marriage for White People? How the African-American Marriage Decline Affects Everyone. I want to thank you so much for the time you spent today explaining all this to the listeners. I love the book. It's terrific. I'm looking forward to your next one.
Thank you. It has been a pleasure.